How do you get started with learning Terraform? Olaf and I will be discussing different ways and tools that we've used to learn Terraform. Please like and subscribe. That way we know that this is the kind of content you want us to continue creating. It may sound redundant, but you can go to the Terraform.io website. It gets into detail about different ways to use Terraform, and we already have a video discussing the Terraform documentation. There are also Terraform resources that you can use to access the different providers on their website. There are videos on all the online providers. I've used Udemy, Pluralsight, and A Cloud Guru. I find that they're useful for getting the overall concepts. You can purchase Udemy and Pluralsight's courses separately. I have purchased the More Than Certified in Terraform. It's a course in Udemy. It covers Terraform, AWS resources, and Kubernetes with AWS.
Say it's More Than Certified?
Yes, More Than Certified.
Okay. And did you think that was pretty good?
I did. I need to dig into it more. It covers like the for each resources and things we'll be covering in future videos. But I thought it was a very good introduction. Like it's not just like create a resource. It's create a resource using the different providers, the different tools, logic, ternary, things like that.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Now, A Cloud Guru is more of a subscription model. You pay per month, but you get access to content that covers Terraform, Google Cloud, AWS, and Azure. So you can kind of get more of a breadth of knowledge, and you don't have to be so targeted.
I find that A Cloud Guru and Pluralsight are oftentimes benefits that you get within an organization, whereas Udemy feels like the thing that we do personally. Pluralsight and A Cloud Guru are things that feels like the things that we.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My last company had a Udemy business account, but I think it's more common that you have Pluralsight or A Cloud Guru.
Yeah, and these are some popular online training. I would also add that there's the opportunity to get in-person training. So I have actually taken a class by Microsoft teaching Terraform, which was interesting. And then there's also HashiCorp will do training events as well. So those are opportunities if you need to build a team really quick on the capabilities, then you could seek more curated or customized training to pass on to your team in its entirety.
Yeah, as you talk about that, it reminds me that when I first started getting into it, they had conferences. We have a local developmental conference, and they had Terraform there for a couple different sessions, and they talked about how they were using it and why they were using it. And it kind of is what sparked me into doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that the provider-based training obviously is going to give you better training around how to use the product. And I think those are going to be available both in person, because I know a lot of that might just be the arrangement that you have with your provider. Mm-hmm. But then they also have sort of individualized training. So if you, for instance, are in GCP, you can go to GCP's website and learn about how to use Terraform in a way that is tailored for GCP's use.
Right, that makes sense. You have to understand the providers that you're using Terraform against. Each cloud provider has its own certifications you can work on. You can learn Terraform, the logic, for each, all those things, but it doesn't do you any good if you don't know what you're building and how you're building it, and also, best practices. So, for instance, an AWS Elastic Beanstalk is a platform as a service that handles websites. And then an Azure App Service is the same, but they're built totally different. You have to build it, you have to build the Elastic Beanstalk AWS's way versus Azure builds their app service. So, you have to know the best practice is. Um, so that, just because you can learn Terraform, you also need to learn the tools, the cloud providers that you're actually building on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We talked a little bit about that when we went over the Terraform documentation. That was one of the sources of confusion, I think, for learning Terraform, because on one hand, you have to learn how to use the product, how to use the language itself, HCL, and then you also have to learn whatever the provider content is. And I think a lot of people group that together, so they think that they're learning both by learning Terraform. I think you would agree that's generally a misnomer.
Yeah. Um, so what I also do to help learn it is I just tinker on my own. I've got my own private Azure account, I and private AWS account, and I just tinker and I'm like, hey, I want to do this thing. So I built out like a template that I've stored in my GitHub that is VNets with private endpoints for like app services, because I feel like eventually somebody's going to ask me how to lock these app services down. So I built out like a sample, tested it out, got it working, and then I stored it somewhere. Very similar to like using like creating your own module if you were going to go down that path. You can use public modules for learning different provider resources when building an environment, but I think you should at least know how the pieces are put together in case you want to change something.
Yeah, I would say that public providers are a convenience, but that in some way they are sort of the antithesis of learning the provider, because they're going to abstract all modules, abstract the details, the nuance of how the provider actually works,
Mm-hmm.
to some great extent, or to varying extent, I guess. So using public providers means that you aren't seeing all of the individual resources or construction that goes into the development of some solutions. So I would say the best training in that case is to create your own module, because then not only do you understand all of the features of the provider that go into what you're creating, but you also understand the Terraform language enough that you can adapt it to something that is more like a function basis within HCL.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I looked at the public AWS Kubernetes module that it seems everyone's using it. It's this really long and big
Yeah.
module. And
Yeah, any of the community run modules are really in depth. I mean, good and bad, right? They're really in depth, but then yeah, you're abstracted from so much, and I guess the complexity too. It gets more and more difficult to maintain or manage that module, or maybe even to influence. If you think about very large modules, they become battleships, and they're solid, but to turn one around takes a little planning.
Right. I agree with that. And then they're trying to account for everybody in the world, and you have a very specific use case. Are you more of a doer for training? We join our Discord, Learning Terraform, and ask questions or help answer questions. I have learned a lot from the community. The questions can run the gamut from very easy to very difficult. There's questions on how to use an extension on the VM scale set. There's questions on how do I format my project, and we usually we can use that opportunity to point them to the more recent video that we created. Just kind of getting when you start building stuff on your own, sometimes it's limited because you have this one use case, you've built out your environments, you're done, but then you have to go hopefully have more projects. But if you join the Discord, then you can kind of get an influx of everybody's situations, and you can help out and learn that way.
Yeah, and it helps over time, because obviously anything that you learn, all of these things that we're talking about, the the website, the online training, in-person training, all of these are fairly static in that point at which you gathered that training was only relevant to the current times, the current versions, etc. If you're part of a community, then obviously you have a more dynamic access to that training material, training. So it just gives you a way to continue the discussion with people so that as things change, as your strategies adapt, then you have a source that you can always go back to and get fresh ideas about that. And there's also Getter.im. I don't know, Jason, if you've ever used Getter. I've used it only a little bit, but Getter has some Terraform resources as well, and they qualify themselves as like the place where developers go to talk. I don't know how big Getter is. You know how many. I know that there's been a couple of things that really able to find a community.
Hmm. No, I've not heard of that before.
There you go. Yeah, maybe not that popular.
Well, I mean, if there's a place where developers tend to go, I probably wouldn't be in it right away. But it's definitely something I'll add to my list.
I think for community, we could probably also throw in Reddit, obviously, and there is a Terraform home in Reddit, and actually we have that linked in our Discord channel as well. So it's one of the feeds that you'll see. But that's a good place to get information. Again, it's less of a discussion, right? More of a forum base, but I still think pretty valuable.
I agree. I just answered a question on that yesterday. You know, be sure to save your file when you're in VS Code. That's step one. I joke, but that's like the third time we said
But
this.
true story. Yeah.
So
and this is perhaps a little bit of a duality between community and online training, but there's YouTube as well, and I could call it community because it's not something that you typically are paying for, though I'm sure there are paid channels that include support training for Terraform. But YouTube is a place where you can also find information on Terraform that is particular to your use case.
yeah, I agree. I use YouTube for Azure training, and I use it for Terraform training and how to cook stuff too. So
I think
very useful.
it's probably the natural place to go. I would say Reddit's probably a natural place to go as well. So Reddit and YouTube are probably a lot of your destinations only because of their popularity, at least in this day and age. One other one, I don't know if you were going to talk on this, but one other one would be books. So there are a couple of books that I have used. There is, let's see, Terraform Up and Running. That is an O'Reilly book, and Terraform Up and Running is actually pretty good. It is one of those things, again, that's kind of a static resource. So you're only going to get information out of there that is as current as it has additions. I'm not sure what edition they're up to. Certainly don't get the first edition of that book, get whatever the latest edition is. And even before you purchase something like that, take a look at the author's information and see if they're working on a new edition. Check to see. Sometimes you can see just within the abstract of the book, what is the version that's covered within that book, or what was the published date. And from that kind of infer, is this going to be something that is useful? Now, I will say, regardless of version, the books have value, like the concepts and the patterns, the methodologies, all of those apply more or less the same in any edition. Although new patterns will emerge with newer editions. So there's Terraform Up and Running, and then there's another one that I've done by O'Reilly, which is Infrastructure as Code. And again, there are more than likely additional versions of this additional edition. Mm-hmm. But Infrastructure as Code, while not just a Terraform book, is really good because I think it studies the concepts and really the methodologies of infrastructure practices. And so it makes it nice because you can adapt those things to your code of choice, being Terraform if you're on this channel. And there are actually mentions of Terraform, obviously some patterns, some examples that come out of that book for Terraform. But by and large, I think it's just good as a concept book.
I would say I agree with you on the versioning as long as you're like version, especially the Terraform up and running, as long as you're like version 12 and above. If
I
you're
might
like,
even say version 13 and above
yeah,
because, yeah, there were like I know, for instance, the count and the for each meta arguments, that stuff only showed up in version 13 for modules,
right.
and that is a very important distinction in terms of patterns that you might follow.
Yeah, so don't go to version like 11 and get that book because you're going to be lost for a while.
It'll put you behind a little bit.
That's all we have this week. Thank you for watching. See you next week.